Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the global launch for the flagship report of the IEA, the World Energy Outlook. This morning, we're delighted to be here at IEA headquarters in Paris and joined by our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, and the two co-lead authors of the report, Laura Coetzee, the IEA Chief Energy Modeler, and Tim Gould, our Chief Energy Economist. We'll first hear from Dr. Birol, and then Laura and Tim will walk us through the main findings of the report. And after the presentations, we will have a short break and take some questions from reporters. I encourage the reporters online to send us their questions through the Zoom Q&A box. This is an exceptional year with the COP just around the corner, and for this reason, for the first time, we're making the WEO report free to download on our website. As usual, this press conference is being live streamed on our social channels, and with this, I would like to turn the floor to Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jed. Greetings to all the colleagues, friends following this event. We are all at the IEA headquarters in Paris, and we would like to share with you some of the key findings of the World Energy Outlook 2021, our annual flagship publication. So, as Jet mentioned, this is exceptional World Energy Outlook for a few reasons. Number one, we are releasing this 1 month before it is usual time. Normally we publish in November, but we come in October in order to provide a guidance for COP26 discussions. The second is exceptional. We are going to, in fact, we just made it freely available to everybody who would like to read our report, give us comments, suggestions, how we can improve our work further. The third exception goes to my colleagues here. I have two exceptional colleagues next to me, Mrs. Laura Coetzee, who is our Chief Energy Modeler, and Mr. Tim Gould, who is our Chief Energy Economist. They did an exceptional work, but with an exceptional team. They work with several colleagues at the IEA, modelers, policymakers, statisticians, communication colleagues, and I am also thankful to all these exceptional colleagues who spend a lot of time in order to make this report earlier than usual time, providing an important public service to the international community. Dear colleagues, I would like to today cover three things. One, the current energy market situation. How does the IEA interpret the current energy market situation? And the second, the main piece, some of the findings, a few findings of the World Energy Outlook I would like to highlight. I am sure my colleagues Laura and Tim will also elaborate these points. But thirdly, I would like to finish, since we have only a few days away from the COP meeting in Glasgow, I would like to put three wishes, three expectations I have from Glasgow meeting. First of all, we all know that the world is seeing, world energy markets, we are seeing very high gas, coal, electricity prices, oil prices are also under rise. And this is, of course, not a good news for the global economy, as it may put pressure on the inflation and hamper the economic growth. My main worry is, of course, in emerging countries, developing countries, especially those in Asia. Now, what is the reason? Why are we seeing this? First of all, what we think, what the reasons are, and also I will say what we think, what are not the reasons, and being portrayed as the main driver of this situation we are in. So we think, dear colleagues, dear friends, there are three major drivers of this situation. Number one, a huge economic growth, a rebound of the global economy, close to 6%, which is the highest since almost last 50 years, mainly fueled by fossil fuels. And as such, I would consider this the recovery is not a sustainable recovery. In my view, we are witnessing an unsustainable economic recovery here. We see that the fossil fuels are growing very strongly. The prices are high, putting a brake on the economic growth. And at the same time, this year, we are seeing the second largest increase in the global emissions in the history. So this is the first reason. As a result of the very strong economic rebound, big growth, spectacular growth for coal and gas and oil is also coming. This is number one. Number two, there were several extreme weather events coming different parts of the world at the same time. In some countries, we have seen, for example, floods, which made a lot of difficulties for the production of energy. In some countries, for example, China and Brazil, a very dry year, drought, which meant hydropower generation was extremely low. As a result, they had to import unexpected levels of gas. So, and of course, we shouldn't forget that in many parts of the world, last year, we have experienced extreme winter and cold temperatures, which also had an impact on the current situation. So this is the second reason, extreme weather events. And third, there were several planned and unplanned disruptions in the supply. There were a lot of maintenance work in the different production areas. It can be oil, gas, or coal. And last year, those maintenance works couldn't be carried out because of COVID. They have been postponed to this year. And this year's planned maintenance and many, many other outages meant the production capacity had a big blow. Our numbers show, for example, on the natural gas side, that this year's outages, planned and unplanned outages, were up to 40% higher than the historical averages. Another reason. So these are the three reasons, main reasons, I should say, why we are seeing this problem, which is risky for the global economy today. Huge economic growth driven by the fossil fuel demand increase. Second is the extreme weather events, and the third one is the planned and unplanned outages. Now, some people are portraying this very situation as the first crisis of clean energy transitions. This is not accurate. This is wrong, and this is a gross mischaracterization which we don't share, to say the least. If there is something to do with clean energy, I think the issue is not that we have too much clean energy, we have this problem, but we had too little clean energy that we had this problem. So therefore, we are very clear, clean energy transition is not the reason what we are experiencing today. Maybe it may well be the solution. And one final word here to the, because we talk about the gas markets all the time, one word to gas industry. I know that many colleagues in the gas industry following our discussions, our reports, our statements carefully. Natural gas has been presented as a reliable, affordable energy source which could complement the clean energy. But the current situation, volatility in the natural gas markets, I believe, is not a good news for natural gas industry. Natural gas industry didn't get good marks from millions of consumers around the world, and I think they should take note of this. Now, this is how we see the current situation, dear colleagues, dear friends. Now, a few findings of the World Energy Outlook, the great work that my colleagues, Mrs. Cozy, Mr. Gould, and their teams carried out. One of the, in my view, most important findings is, especially before COP, many governments, more and more governments around the world are making pledges, coming with commitments, some of them 2050, some of them earlier, some of them later. What does it mean for the climate change if you put them together for COP, and what does it mean for the energy markets? We call it the announced pledges scenario. All the countries coming together making these pledges. And I should first of all say that we are thankful to those governments. We have never seen ambition on climate change so much. But there's a big but here. If you put all these pledges together, dear colleagues, we see that around 2030, for example, they only cover the 20% of the gap we should reach to our 1.5 degrees target. Only 20%. And in terms of temperature increase, it brings us a temperature increase in line with 2.1 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Still, it could have catastrophic implications for the rather fragile equilibrium of our planet. I think, Lara, you will cover this issue more in depth, so I would maybe say a few words on the energy implications of these pledges, commitments governments are putting on the table. While this response, these pledges, are far from being satisfactory to address our climate problem, it can have major implications for the global energy markets. I want to give you two examples. On the oil industry, with the pledges governments have on the table, only the ones we have now, because more can come in the next days and weeks or months to come. If they are implemented, we see a clear peak of oil demand by 2025. This is important, and this is mainly driven by what is happening in the auto industry, car manufacturing. Many governments have put policies in place as of 2030 or around 2030. They would only allow net zero vehicles. Several car manufacturers, the largest ones, they have put the electric cars as their main business and their focus. And in some of them, big ones, some of them are going to manufacture only electric cars by 2030. And if you come to today, just I have fresh numbers. China, September figures. More than 20% of the all cars sold in China are electric cars as of today, as we speak. And this is the largest car market in the world. Europe, another big market. More than 20% of the cars sold are electric cars. And globally today, we have about 5% of all the cars sold electric cars. And we expect, if the governments fulfill their promises in their rather unsatisfactory response to climate change scenario, we will see they will go to 30% by 2030, which at the end of the day will end up with oil demand peak by 2025. And we also see, on the other hand, a big increase in the renewables, if those are fulfilled, especially for wind and solar, more than doubling of the annual capacity additions. So this is, once again, I would like to highlight of those colleagues who look at the energy markets carefully, be aware, even an unsatisfactory answer to our climate problem may well have huge implications for the energy markets, and we shouldn't be myopic and just looking at today, but as I said, those policies will have major implications. In our report, we didn't, of course, only look at the announced pledges. My colleagues look at what needs to happen to go from this current pledges to our scenario, which is 1.5 degrees, if we can do that. They have came up with 4 major policies that can be easily put in place if the governments put the right regulations, right standards and norms, and if the financing is there. So therefore, we can go from this unsatisfactory answer to our climate problem to a solution to our climate problem, reaching the trajectory of 1.5 degrees by putting emphasis on these 4 major policy categories. And I think it is you, Laura, who is going to talk about this and explain to us. Now, dear colleagues, 2 last points about the VO, and I would like to stop there, the VO part. On the investment front, if the investment trajectory on the energy sector continues as we have now, I see a looming risk that we may well see more and more turbulences in the global energy markets. When we look at the, for example, oil and gas investments today, 2020 and 2021, they are in line with the oil and gas investments required in a 1.5 degrees trajectory for lower oil and gas demand trajectory to meet that one current oil and gas investments about $350 billion today. But important thing is demand is growing. Therefore, what we have to do is we have to increase the investments in clean energy and reduce the demand for oil and gas. What we see is that the current clean energy investments are not sufficient. In order to have an orderly transition that the IEA calls for, we have to triple clean energy investments. Otherwise, we might well see, if those investments, clean energy investments, don't come through, we may well see a lot of turbulences in the energy markets as we are experiencing today. My last point about the World Energy Outlook is, dear colleagues, is about the very good news, in my view, about the climate change and future of energy. The message is clear. Maybe it is the most important message for me coming this World Energy Outlook. The message is clear. A new global energy economy is emerging. An energy economy which is cleaner, which is safer, much more moderner, and which is much more resilient and much more fair across the countries. I would like to say that perhaps, Tim, you are going to share this in depth, but I wanted to highlight the very fact that our numbers show that the clean energy manufacturers, those industries, such as the solar PV, wind, lithium-ion batteries, the hydrogen, the electrolyzers, when you look at the market size of these together, their market size in the future will be bigger than the market size of oil industry today. And I see that there is a growing appetite from the investor side today to the different industry players, investors, institutional investors, and the others, that there is a great interest, and I'm sure this interest will be translated more and more into financial flows in to make the future's clean energy technology happening. So these are some news findings from the World Energy Outlook. I would like to finish my wish list from the COP26 as I promised, and I would be looking forward to hear my colleagues, Mrs. Cozy and Mr. Gould. Dear colleagues, we have only a few days to COP, and we are, as International Energy Agency, talking with many government leaders, businesses, other different stakeholders to have a successful outcome for COP26. And I would like to here once again congratulate the UK government for their leadership on the way to Glasgow, and I hope we will have a very good discussions and a good outcome. I would like to see three things coming from COP. First, I mentioned in the beginning that the current commitments from governments are not strong enough to bring us to the trajectory that we would like to see, which is the 1.5 degrees trajectory. And I would like to see more and more countries make commitments, and the existing commitments of the countries, especially for the next 10 years, would be stronger. This is the first wish. The second wish I have is that I mentioned about the critical importance of clean energy investments. And when I look at the world, the big chunk of these investments need to come from the emerging countries. And therefore, I would like very much to see that there are some financial support or mechanisms built in order to mobilize investment, clean energy investments in developing countries. And we talk about this $100 billion. It seems it is coming through, but if it comes through, it is good. But for me, it is only the floor of the need in the developing countries for the clean energy transitions, more to come. Third and the final is maybe a political wish. I would like to see that the world leaders coming together in Glasgow and giving a message to the rest of the world, including the investors, to say that you investor, we are united to build a clean energy future. We are giving you an unmistakable signal. If you continue to invest in the dirty energy, you may well risk of losing money. Bad time. But also an unmistakable signal to investors that you investor, we are determined as the leaders of the world here to build a clean energy future, because we believe that a new global energy economy is emerging. Therefore, if you invest in clean energy, you can make some handsome profits. I wish this message would also come through from Glasgow. With this now, Jet, I would like to turn to you for the rest of our meeting.
Thank you very much. And then we'll turn actually directly to Laura for the presentation, followed by Tim. So Laura, please.
So thank you very much, Jad, and thank you very much, Dr. Birol, for these introductory remarks. So Tim Gould and I will actually take you more in depth through the findings of the World Energy Outlook this year. Let me start with the emissions. If we look at where we stand today, we come from several decades of continuous growth in emissions with a dip that we have experienced last year due to the COVID crisis. We are now experiencing, as Dr. Birol mentioned, a very, very steep rebound in emission. But if we put ourselves a few years back, just as we are now entering the Glasgow negotiations, before the Paris Agreement in 2015, our expectations for global CO2 emissions was very clear. We were expecting a very steady increase in CO2 emissions, with the world continuing to rely very strongly on fossil fuels. And this would have led to actually catastrophic climate change, 3.5 degrees increase in temperature by 2100. Now we are a couple of weeks ahead of the Glasgow meeting, and countries have put in place, since Paris, new policies. Technology costs for clean energy have gone down very significantly, and the expectation is very different. While we were seeing emissions steadily rising, already with the policies that we have in law today, emissions are set after the rebound this year, very small increase, and basically stabilizing after that. Now, in the Paris Agreement was very clearly stipulated that we needed to ratchet up ambition. And this is what countries are doing in the run-up to Glasgow. As of today, countries accounting for 50% of emissions have put forward new ambition for 2030. And countries accounting for nearly 70% of CO2 emissions have actually put in place net zero pledges. Now, what we have done for the first time this year is analyzing all these pledges around the world. And what are the implications of those on CO2 emissions and on energy markets? And what we find is the following. Actually, for the first time in human history, we would be entering the decade of the turning point. Turning point for what? We would be experiencing economic growth with declining CO2 emissions. This is major. Humankind, we have never managed to do something like that. This turning point is not only for emissions, but very clearly is a turning point for energy markets. And here is what we see here very clearly. If we go ahead only with policies that are currently engraved in laws, the past looks very much like the future is really the stubbornness of the status quo that we would be experiencing. Put it another way, we would really very much see stormy weathers and stormy markets, increase in oil, increase in gas, and of course, increase in renewables. However, as Dr. Birol mentioned earlier on, announced pledges do change the picture, change the energy markets. What you can see here very clearly, oil, we would see a growth in the next couple of years, rebound, but as of 2025, we are seeing a flattening out. As Dr. Birol mentioned, a key reason for this is very clearly electric vehicles. We are expecting to see a huge growth from around 5% today, electric vehicle sales accounting for global market, up to 30% in 2030. This is a combination of choices of car manufacturers that are really changing their business models, and at the same time, a big policy push by countries and cities around the world. So the largest segment in energy markets today, road, passenger, would enter in a structural decline from now on and bring oil to a peak. Very similar story we would see for natural gas, continued increase up to 2025, but then a flattening out. Why? For two key reasons. Two of the main sectors that are demanding natural gas today, electricity generation and the building sector, would actually go, as is the case for road passenger transport, into structural decline. The demand for those two segments in 2030 would be lower than what we see today. If you look at the electricity sector in particular, clearly this is the push of many countries around the world to go to net zero in the electricity sector first, with a big push in clean energy technologies, in particular solar and wind. For gas and gas in buildings, one example is clearly the renovation wave, such as the one that we are seeing in the European Union. Now, this new energy economy, you have it here in front of you in this graph. You have renewables generation skyrocketing, and at the same time, car manufacturers really changing their business model. A decade in which, again, for the first time, very significant in human history, after 2 decades in which we saw the share of fossil fuels very, very stubbornly around 80%, starting to decline and go down to around 70%. Now, what about coal? If we have a focus, a zoom, and we look at what's happening to new coal power plant. Now, very often we focus on the good news that over the past several years, 2020 included the first months of this year, renewables are growing very, very strongly. At the same time, we often forget that actually the last decade was the one in which we installed on a yearly basis the largest amount of unabated coal-fired generation. Now, looking forward, with announced pledges, again, a very clear turning point. What we see is new installation would be cut in half in this decade and then crawl to very low level. We are not at zero yet, which was one of the first milestones that we highlighted back in May in our net zero report, but what we heard, the new announcement from China in September, of the intention of ending support for projects above would actually cut further into these new additions. You can see here that basically this would be the last decade in which we would see new coal-fired power installation to generate electricity. This announcement from China in itself is significant, not only for the power sector, but also for global emissions. We estimate that if those cancellations, those projects were not to go ahead, we would save emissions of around 20 gigatons. To give you an order of magnitude, this is the same amount of savings that we would get from the European Union going to net zero by 2050. However, the coal story is more complicated than just new coal-fired installation. All what we have installed up to now actually is continuing to operate, and this leads us to continuous emissions. So if we look at the CO2 emission trajectory that the Glasgow pledges are bringing us to, and we compare it to where we would need to be if we were to follow a pathway consistently with 1.5 degrees, we see that there is a huge gap. In fact, as Dr. Birol mentioned earlier, the Glasgow pledges in 2030 would cover only 20% of this gap of emission reduction. If you want to see it another way, we are actually going into the Glasgow negotiation not with the glass half empty, is actually 80% empty. And we are an analytical body, so what we have done is trying to understand how we could bridge this gap. And the key finding for us is that actually 40% of this emission reduction would be cost effective. It means really for us, it's tough to understand why those emission reductions are not on the table, because there is not an economic rationale behind not doing those. What are those? Dr. Birol mentioned them already. First and foremost, we are seeing wind and solar becoming so cheap that we could not only go to the nearly 500 gigawatts that we see in the announced policy scenario, but top around 800 gigawatts with no cost to consumers, while at the same time reducing and denting the emissions from existing coal. Similarly, if we expand nuclear lifetime extension, new nuclear and new hydropower, we would similarly do this cut into existing coal, which is really half of this remaining ambition gap. Other measures that we find are cost effective are actually methane abatement. You know very well that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. We are actually wasting gas into the atmosphere, even now where we are living in very high prices, very difficult to understand, and we find that most of the methane abatement actually would come with cost-effective measures. Policies we know that are effective and technologies are available here on the market today. Similarly for energy efficiency, in particular for new products, new appliances, and trucks. And finally, another area where we do see the opportunity to push further is electrification and electric vehicle. Clearly, there is a remaining gap there that is filled with a lot of new technology, and Tim Gould will take you through those in a second. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mokotsi and Dr. Birol, for those words of introduction. I'd like to follow on from what Dr. Coetzee was saying with another way to view the changes in the energy system that we're describing is to consider the implications for international trade. For the moment, the picture you see on the screen, dominated by oil, it is, as we speak, the most valuable commodity of them all. But you'll notice there's a new element in our analysis of this, and those are the critical minerals that are used in the energy sector. For the moment, that's mostly copper for transmission lines and for a wide range of electrical appliances. But as we'll see, that becomes a much more important part of the picture in the future. What does that look like in 2050 if all of today's announced pledges are implemented. In that scenario, oil retains a predominant role, but the patterns of trade are quite different by then. Some of today's major importers, such as the European Union and China, they reduce their consumption and imports. And we see a concentration in trade flows between the Middle East and other developing economies in Asia, which implies a reconfigured set of political relationships also around oil in this scenario. But you'll also notice there are some new kids on the block. You start to see low-carbon hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels coming into the picture. Many countries have the potential to produce hydrogen, but production costs vary widely around the world by about 3 or 4 times, and that creates incentives to trade. And as a result, we start to see exports from some regions, including Australia, parts of the Middle East, parts of Latin America, going predominantly into Northeast Asia. In the net zero emissions scenario, our trade picture is completely overturned. Combined share of hydrogen, critical minerals, above 80% by then, and we get a clear indication of the strategic importance of not just copper, but lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths for the future of the energy sector. So watch out for changes in energy trade as we move forward. Trade patterns, producer policies, geopolitical considerations, they remain very important even as we move towards a more electrified and renewables-rich energy system. We turn now to investment, a topic that Dr. Birol mentioned already. For many years now, the World Energy Outlook has warned of a potential mismatch between investment in different parts of the energy sector, and this is now becoming quite acute. In the case of oil and gas, the amount of money being spent on the upstream is now half of what it was in 2014. And of course, we're all aware that on the demand side, things haven't changed by anything like as much. And the reasons why that investment has been halved is primarily due to 2 major oil price falls in 2015 and again in 2020. Now, the industry is able to do more with less. It's much more efficient, leaner than it was in 2014. But still, as was mentioned, today's oil and gas investment is really geared towards a future in which consumption is stagnant or even in decline. And as was mentioned, it's actually reasonably well aligned with what would be needed over the rest of this decade in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And let's remind ourselves that in that scenario, there are no new fields approved for development after 2021, and there are sharp reductions in fossil fuel demand. And if we consider the other side of the picture, investment in clean energy technologies and related infrastructure was much more resilient in 2020 than oil and gas spending, and we expect there to be another slight uptick this year. But we are well out of line with what would be required to meet a 1.5-degree trajectory. So what we're seeing in energy markets today, as we've emphasized in the introduction, it's not related to clean energy transitions or climate policies, but the mismatch that you're looking at on the screen, it does create risks for the future. The way forward is clear, a major boost in clean energy investment across all technologies and all markets. But while this mismatch persists, there will remain a strong risk of further price swings and increased volatility in the future. I'd like to now consider the implications of price volatility for consumers. How would a future price spike affect consumers in the different scenarios that we look at? Our starting point today for an average household is a situation where roughly half of household energy bills go on oil. Mostly that's petrol to fill up your cars. Around 1/3 is to pay for electricity, for appliances, air conditioners, and so on. And in the Northern Hemisphere in particular, there's a significant share going towards your heating bills, primarily met by gas. So in the stated policy scenario, those average household energy bills rise by about 15% over the next 10 years. There are slight structural changes to the composition of those bills, but they're not huge, and oil and gas prices are slightly higher than those that we've seen in recent years. In a rapid energy transition of the sort that we model in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, the bills fall by around 10% compared to today. Why is that? It's because appliances, air conditions are much more efficient, buildings are more energy efficient, mobility is more electrified, so households are more likely to be plugging their cars in than filling them up with fuel. And heating, in many cases, is also becoming more electrified with installations of heat pumps that are many times more efficient than the fossil fueled equivalents. And because demand is lower, average prices for oil and gas are also lower. So what happens then if we shock these systems in 2030 with a sharp rise in oil and gas prices? This would be 30% less costly to households in a case of rapid energy transitions compared to a more gradual approach. Now, these benefits are significant, but they don't come for free. They require a significant amount of additional investment in the meantime in more low emissions equipment, in electric cars, in efficiency retrofits, and so on. As Laura explained, these solutions are typically very cost effective, but many households, especially poorer ones, will require help from governments to manage the upfront costs. In this final slide, I wanted to come back to a theme that Dr. Birol opened our session with, the emergence of the new global energy economy. So what does this new global energy economy look like? It's more electrified, it's more efficient in many ways, it's more interconnected, it's more digital, and it's certainly cleaner than the one we have. And it also brings huge opportunities for growth and employment. And we illustrate that here. If the world gets on track for net zero emissions by 2050, then the market opportunity for manufacturers of equipment that you see on the screen, fuel cells, electrolyzers, battery packs, wind turbines, solar PV modules, is simply huge. In a net zero pathway, these 5 equipment markets alone would be of comparable size to today's oil market by mid-century. And that's creating enormous prospects for companies that are well positioned along a growing set of global supply chains. And with that, a few concluding thoughts. We've heard from the Executive Director at the start how it is inaccurate to lay the responsibility for today's market turbulence at the door of climate policies. And our analysis of household energy bills strongly supports the view that well-managed energy transitions are the solution to the sort of volatility that we are seeing today in gas, coal, and electricity markets. And then Dr. Coetzee has highlighted the ways that countries around the world can step up their ambitions, particularly over the next 10 years. The elements that she highlighted are proven, they're tried and tested. There's so much more that can be done cost effectively to keep the door to a 1.5 degree future open. Now, a missing link is finance and investment. We need this policy-driven surge in clean energy investment as a solution to the mismatch that we see in today's investment flows. But our warning today is clear. The longer today's imbalance persists, the greater the risk of a bumpy ride ahead. So we talked about risks, but let's too have in mind the size of the prize for growth and employment as we move to a net zero emission system and a new global energy economy. And finally, as we look ahead to COP26, energy transitions depend on many groups, communities, companies, civil society, investors, but no one has the same capacity and influence as governments to shape our energy destiny. So we look to government leaders in Glasgow for an unmistakable signal that they are committed to rapidly scaling up the clean and resilient technologies of the future. And with that, Jad, I pass the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much, Laura, for a very comprehensive presentation, and Dr. Birol. We're now going to take a 2-minute break as we collect questions, and we'll be right back to you for the Q&A part of our presentation. Thank you. Welcome back, and thank you for being with us for the Q&A part of our presentation. We've received a lot of questions here, and we will try to go through as many as possible, but if we don't get to your question, we will get back to you today, or email us at press@iea.org. So we're going to have 2 rounds of 3 questions, which I will distribute here to our panelists. The first one, we will get a question from Eric Albert from Le Monde, which I will direct to Laura. Do you believe that the 1.5 degree path can be reached without hurting global growth? In other words, you believe degrowth is unavoidable if the world wants to control climate change. I will read the questions as well to the other 2 questions. One merging question we just got from AFP, from Catherine Howers. With the current energy crisis, many countries are raising their coal production. What short-term and long-term consequences could that have on emissions, energy, etc.? A very similar question from Javier Blas from Bloomberg about having coal in the NZE scenario, even as we're seeing an increase in coal consumption. And a third question for this first round to Dr. Birol from a colleague from ENDS Europe. Can you give specific examples of what the EU can do to bridge the ambition gap? Thank you. So first question to Laura, please.
So thank you very much, Jad. So the question is whether we can achieve net zero by 2050, 1.5 degrees, without hurting the economy and without using degrowth. Actually, our answer is very clear. When we look at what's happening around the world in terms of recovery plans, we have seen mobilization of around $17 trillion around the world to stimulate the economy. And when we look at how much of that is going to clean energy, only 2% of it is going to clean energy transitions. This for us is an amount that is far too small, is only a third of what we have assessed would be needed to put the world on a path to 1.5, increase economic growth, and actually create a sustainable pathway of new jobs over the next several years. Analysis that we have done with the International Monetary Fund for the Net Zero report shows that very clearly. The type of push in clean energy investment that Mr. Gould mentioned earlier was actually create a boost to global economic growth. So not only we don't need degrowth, but the push in clean energy transition could lift up even faster our global economy out of the COVID crisis.
Many thanks. Second question, Tim.
So I'd like to take the question on coal and how do we view the current rise that we're seeing in 2021 in coal consumption. And in many ways, it's linked to themes that we've raised already. We are seeing an unsustainable recovery. And one of the key reasons for that is also, as just mentioned by Dr. Coetzee, we haven't had the boost of investment that we would need to see in a range of clean energy technologies that would have averted the sorts of developments that we are seeing now. Having said that, many of the factors behind the immediate rise in coal consumption, they are likely to be temporary. And then there's a question then for policymakers about how they reconfigure the power sector in the years to come. And in our view, there's 4 key components of that drive to bring down coal use in the power sector. One of them we focused on in our presentation, no new approvals of coal-fired power plants. We're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. A second extremely important component is we need to build up the alternative generation capacity or the alternative investments that would allow us to meet the demand that would otherwise be met by coal. And there are demand-side aspects to that in efficiency and, of course, supply-side aspects to that in low emissions generation. A third question is then, how do you bring down the emissions from the existing coal-fired fleet? Remember, there's more than 2,000 gigawatts of coal operating in the world today. And we have a 3-pronged strategy in order to manage those emissions. In some cases, you can adjust the operation of those coal-fired plants to provide flexibility, much needed flexibility to power systems. In some cases, you can reduce the emissions from their operation, for example, by co-firing with ammonia or by retrofitting with carbon capture, utilization and storage. But also, there is the option which we analyze in detail in our new outlook to retire. And that brings in the fourth component, which is how to manage the social and economic consequences of those developments. And I think it's particularly important that we take an early and sustained engagement from governments and from international financial institutions in order to manage those social and economic consequences as well as we can.
Jad, before going to the question about Europe, I wanted to, at one point here, looking at the hearing team, about the people, the citizens. One of my biggest worries is that how we are going to make this clean energy transition as inclusive as possible, and we all should know that these clean energy transitions are for and about people. And therefore, in my view, as the countries have their strategy for hydrogen, for batteries, for others, every government, across the government, they should have a strategy how they are going to make sure that this unwanted, undesired implications of clean energy transition, which will come, should be addressed at the community level, at local level, at a macro level. This transition will not be an easy one. It will not be a rose garden, but it is in the hands of the governments to make it as smooth as possible. Coming back to the question about Europe, what Europe should do go from the current levels to much deeper reduction in emissions, I would say just immediately three things. One, much stronger efficiency improvement. Second, reduce the methane emissions, most of them being cost effective, as much as possible, and continue with the renewable penetration. But in my view, in some countries where it is acceptable to make use of the nuclear power could be another option that we should not forget. And for Europe, in addition to what to do at home, I have one thing I would like to underline. International climate diplomacy. I think we are all very lucky who live in Europe and in the world that we have Mr. Timmermans, who is leading the European international climate policy dossier. But in the member countries of European countries, as much as they put attention, focus on their domestic climate policies, clean energy transition, I think they should be also more and more engaged to help the other countries around the world, to incentivize the other countries around the world. As we all know, emissions don't have a passport, and Europe, being the years and years, being the leader of the fight against climate change, should have another task internationally, in addition to have their domestic homeworks. Jet, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. So second round of three questions. Again, I will pass them on. The first question from Camilla Nashert from S&P Global. There's a couple of questions from S&P. I'll just put them together. The question here is, you highlight the investment shortfalls hindering renewable growth and decarbonization. How important are sustainable finance rulebooks to bring more money into renewables and reducing fossil fuel funding? Probably this question for you, Tim. Second question from Jeremy Cresswell from Energy Voice. You say progress, to Laura, you say progress towards a low-carbon energy world is far too slow, quote. So is humankind in reality drinking, image here from the question, in the last chance saloon? It seems that way. Is it too late, in other words? And the third question to Dr. Birol, perhaps to wrap it up, question from Bloomberg. Is the world investing enough in oil and gas and coal if the world is on the path of the STEPS or APS scenario? Do you think the industry needs to increase investment in fossil fuel?
It is from our friend Javier Blas.
From Javier Blas from
Perfect.
Bloomberg, indeed. So first question to Tim, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jad, and thanks very much for the question. It's about the issue of sustainable finance and how this can help channel investment to where it's needed. So we have looked in some detail at the developments on the sustainable finance side, and many of them are very positive. On the first half of 2021, $850 billion of sustainable debt issuance. That's more than in the whole of 2020. However, there's two caveats to our view on this issue. And the first is the importance of improving the quality, the comparability of the metrics and the disclosure requirements so that it's easier for people to navigate this space. I think many people still find it quite confusing to work your way through all of the different the disclosures and various other aspects of this. And the second important aspect relates to something that Dr. Birol mentioned in his opening remarks, and that's the importance of getting finance to emerging and developing economies. And so then we need to be sure that as major financial institutions align with a net zero pathway, they are not excluding possibilities to assist emerging and developing economies with their own transitions, or more broadly, they are not excluded from possibilities to work with high emission sectors such as cement or other industrial activities from assisting in those transitions. So those are the areas that we're particularly focused on also in relation to sustainable finance.
Thank you, Tim. Laura, is it too late?
Is it too late? So I think the findings of our announced pledge scenario are clear. We would be heading to 2.1 degrees. IPCC report in August reminded us very clearly that a world that warms at 2 degrees takes far too high risks and costs. We have been living ourselves on our skins what has happened in terms of extreme weather events, floodings, and heat waves over the past several months. So we need to do and accelerate and do things faster. So the lessons from this World Energy Outlook into Glasgow are clearly three. We see no economic reasons why we couldn't slash the emission more. We find 6 gigatons would come at no cost. We have mentioned the 4 measures that we have analyzed. So first, push at the no-cost measure. Second, look at financing. We see that 70% of the investment gap to reach net zero is actually in emerging economies. So that has to be solved and to be solved quickly, a big scale up in investment in emerging economies. And third, if it's unlikely that everything will be solved at Glasgow, a ratchet up mechanism similar to what we have seen in Paris, where year over year countries can come together and push the ambition further would be essential. One lesson from Paris is very clearly that year after year technology costs go down. Our expectation is that in the years to come, cost of hydrogen, cost of other emerging technologies will decline. This will create confidence and push greater ambitions in more difficult sectors such as steel, cement, aviation, and shipping. So those 3 key messages for us going into COP: focus on the cost-effective measures to close the gap. Second, look at financing. And third, ratchet up mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Laura. And Dr. Birol, the question from Javier Blas.
Can I look at the Mr. Blas question one more time there? It is...
First, yep.
Yes.
Is
the world investing enough in oil and gas and coal? What happens if the current trends continue? Do you think the industry needs to increase investment in fossil fuels? Now, the current trends, Mr. Blas, I would tell you that yes, we are seeing oil prices going up today over $80, but per barrel. But it is, I don't believe it is now current situation is as a result of lack of investments. We have today about 96 million barrels of oil consumption. And just before the crisis, it was 100 million barrels per day. So 4 million barrels per day less. I am talking about MBDs for your benefit, Mr. Blas. I don't talk about the exajoules. So the issue is here. I would be careful to link this price increase today, lack of investments today. This is number one. Number two, you are completely right. And my colleague, Mr. Gould, mentioned, we see a mismatch between the demand coming strongly, but for the energy, but on the oil and gas side, not enough investments to meet the demand growth. What we need to do is not, as you suggest, to invest more coal, oil, and gas, but in order to cover that gap, we have to invest in demand-side policies. I mentioned electric cars coming very, very quickly. I mentioned the efficiency policies, solar, wind, hydrogen, they are coming quickly. We have to invest those in order to narrow the gap rather than investing more on coal and the others as you suggest. So I understood, Jet, we have many other questions, but we all have many things to do. And I understand thousands of colleagues, not only the journalists watching us, we don't want to take their time. But if I may, Jet, I would like to finish by saying that many thanks to all the colleagues from the media following us. Many thanks to all the colleagues around the world, thousands of colleagues and friends following us. And also many thanks to, once again, to my colleagues, Mrs. Cozy, Mr. Gould, and their great World Energy Outlook team. Dear colleagues, we at the IEA believe very much the message coming from the World Energy Outlook, the main message, which is that a new global energy economy is emerging. And the International Energy Agency is very determined that this new global energy economy, which is cleaner, more resilient and fairer, is with us earlier than later. I thank you very much from the headquarters of International Energy Agency in Paris. Thank you.